My name is Ethan Callahan. I am the founder and CEO of Callahan and Associates Environmental Consulting, a firm David and I built from nothing 8 years ago and grew, quietly and deliberately, into a name now spoken with real weight across 2 continents. I had been an environmental engineer for the better part of 2 decades by then, but the company itself was still young the day this story really begins. Young enough that its entire future still fit inside the space of one man's decision to either stay broken or start building. None of that mattered, though. In the particular moment the wheels of the aircraft kissed the runway at Miami International with a small, unceremonious shudder, and just like that, 7 years collapsed into a single afternoon. I had spent those years designing treatment trains on the other side of the world, learning to speak in the patient vocabulary of engineers, men and women who understood that nothing clean ever happens instantly, that every system needs its retention time, the interval in which raw influent is held long enough for the ugliness inside it to settle, to be broken down, to become something a city can live beside without flinching. I had applied that principle to reactors and clarifiers and constructed wetlands for 7 years. I had never once thought to apply it to myself, until the moment my feet touched Florida soil again and I understood, with the flat clarity of a man reading his own instrument panel, that I had not been away. I had been detained, held, steeping in a basin of my own making, waiting for something in me to settle. I took the Metrorail south, then a bus, because I wanted the ordinary violence of transit to distract me, and it failed completely. Every mile toward Redland peeled back a year. By the time the bus turned off the highway and began threading through the flatlands where mango groves and avocado orchards spread out in long green ledgers, where royal palms swayed with the unhurried patience of things that have never needed to be anywhere else, I was 40 years old and 23 at once, a man built out of 2 timelines that refused to reconcile. Redland had always been Miami's exhale. 40 minutes from the glass towers and the traffic that clenched like a fist along Brickell Avenue. This was a place where houses stood far enough apart that a man's grief had room to breathe, where the loudest sound most mornings was a mockingbird working through its repertoire. The farming families who worked this soil had known each other for generations, and their kind of quiet, unhurried familiarity had always felt to me like a buffer zone. The same principle we design into a treatment system when we place a calm equalization basin between a violent industrial discharge and the delicate biology downstream that has to survive it. Redland had been my equalization basin long before I understood I needed one. My mother had left me the house here 9 years earlier, and I had left it 7 years ago, and now I was returning to it with the specific gravity of a man who no longer knew which version of himself would be doing the returning. My mother died first. Then, within a year, Claire left. I have never been able to decide which loss taught me more about impermanence. Claire Whitmore had married an environmental engineer with the optimism of someone who believed love could be its own load-bearing structure. I built things slowly and deliberately. Remediation plans, permit applications, the quiet, unglamorous machinery that keeps a watershed from poisoning itself. And I loved that slowness. Claire's family did not share my patience. Her father, Stefan Whitmore, had built Whitmore Heritage Development into one of Miami's most formidable property empires through instinct, leverage, and an appetite that never seemed to reach satiety. Her mother, Margareth, moved through rooms like she was auditing them. To people who measured a man's worth in the velocity of his ascent, I must have looked stationary. Worse than stationary, becalmed, a vessel that had simply stopped generating thrust. For the first year of our marriage, Claire defended me with real conviction. I remember the brightness in her eyes when she used to describe my work to her parents' friends at dinner parties, the way she'd square her shoulders slightly, chin lifted, daring anyone to find the profession unglamorous. But conviction, I would learn, has its own retention time too, and hers began to run out roughly 18 months in, right around when her father introduced her to Sid Kerrigan. Sid was everything Stefan admired distilled into a single ambitious young man. Quick, well-tailored, hungry in a way that photographed well. He didn't build anything so much as he accelerated other people's building, skimming margin off every transaction he touched. Stefan began comparing us in small, surgical ways that never quite rose to the level of open insult, which somehow made them worse. A remark about real estate versus red tape. A raised eyebrow when I mentioned a project timeline measured in years rather than quarters. Margaretha's compliments always arrived with an undertow. The final 2 years of our marriage were governed by a slow-building pressure I recognized, professionally, as scale formation, mineral deposits accumulating along a pipe wall, invisible at first, then narrowing the channel degree by degree until the whole system seizes. Our arguments were never really about money. They were about velocity, about whether a man's worth could be measured by how fast he moved. We drove out to Coral Gables together the evening Stefan and Margareth summoned us. A mansion with a driveway longer than some city blocks, hedges trimmed into the kind of geometric perfection that announces money before you've even reached the door. Stefan showed us into a living room with ceilings so high our voices seemed to evaporate before they reached each other. Margareth arranged herself in a wing chair near the window and said almost nothing for the rest of the evening, her attention moving between Claire's face and mine with the quiet, unhurried scrutiny of an auditor reconciling two ledgers she already suspected wouldn't match. It was Stefan who did the talking. Ethan, he didn't sit. He never sat when he wanted to hold a room. Let me ask you something plainly, because I find plain questions save everyone a great deal of time. Do you have ambition? I have direction, I said. I'm not certain those are the same thing to you as they are to me. They're not, he agreed, almost pleasantly. Mine moves. Do you intend to make my daughter happy, Ethan? Or do you intend to keep her exactly where you are? Comfortable. Safe. Going nowhere in particular. I love Claire, I said, and I believe she loves me. We built this marriage out of choices we made with our eyes open. Both of us. Love, he said, is a very inexpensive thing to say in a room like this one. He let his hand drift, briefly, toward the chandelier, the high windows, the whole cathedral of money surrounding us. It doesn't purchase comfort. It doesn't purchase freedom. I built freedom for my daughter one deal at a time, Ethan. I'd like to know what exactly you're building for her, beyond patience. I told him about the practice I was assembling. The clients already circling in Tampa and Jacksonville, the long, unglamorous arithmetic of remediation work that would, given enough time, add up to something durable. He listened with the specific, unhurried courtesy of a man already certain of his verdict, nodding at intervals that felt less like agreement than like a man checking boxes on a form he'd decided to reject before I'd walked in the door. Very admirable, he said, once I'd finished. Slow. Careful. Admirable. He let the last word sit there just long enough to curdle. Then he turned, finally, to Claire, who had said nothing this entire time, her eyes fixed on the pattern of the rug as though it held an answer she couldn't locate anywhere else in the room. Claire, is this the life you want? Claire didn't answer. That silence was the answer, and I felt it land somewhere behind my sternum long before I understood what it would eventually cost me. In the car afterward, the quiet between us had a texture I could almost measure, the specific, unstable hush of a resin curing before it's ready to bear any real load. I broke it first. You didn't say anything back there, I said. Why? What was I supposed to say? Something. Anything. We've talked about this life a dozen times. Claire, you knew exactly what you were marrying into. We had a plan. Plans change, Ethan. Not this fast. Not in 20 minutes in your parents' living room. I kept my eyes on the road because I didn't entirely trust what my face was doing. I'm building something real. The Tampa clients, the Jacksonville contracts, People are already calling me for remediation work up and down that coast. None of that has changed. I haven't changed. That's exactly the problem, she said, and there was something in her voice I hadn't heard from her before. Not sadness exactly, but a kind of exhausted agreement with her father, as though she'd been rehearsing his argument privately for months and was only now letting it out loud. You're going to spend the next 20 years building something slowly, one careful permit at a time, and I'm supposed to just be patient the entire way through. You told me you understood that. Before we got married, you told me you wanted exactly this kind of life. I know what I told you. She turned to look out the window instead of at me. Sid doesn't ask anyone to be patient. Sid builds things fast, and he's already further along in 3 years than you'll be in 15. Something in my chest went very still, the particular stillness of an instrument confirming a value you'd already suspected and had hoped, right up until that second, would read differently. Is that what this is about? Sid. She didn't answer right away. When she finally spoke, her voice had dropped to something close to a whisper, as though quieter words might somehow do less damage on their way out. Sid is better than you, she said. Why can't you be like Sid? I felt it land somewhere just beneath my sternum, a specific, localized pain, the kind you'd associate with a physical blow rather than a sentence. My hands went cold on the steering wheel. My jaw locked so tightly I could feel the tendons standing along my neck. I did not cry. I did not raise my voice. I simply understood, with the finality of a load calculation that returns a negative safety margin, that whatever respect Claire had once held for me had reached zero. David Ashford got me through what came after. He and I had known each other since university, the same age, the same graduating class, two engineers who'd bonded over the unglamorous poetry of infrastructure. And when my marriage folded, David simply showed up, not with speeches, but with presence, the kind of quiet, load-bearing friendship that asks nothing and holds everything. His younger sister Emma, 10 years David's junior and mine as well, was often there too in those months, though at the time I registered her only at the edge of my attention, a peripheral kindness in a period defined by loss. David mentioned his father more than once during that stretch, almost in passing. Arthur Ashford had spent the better part of 3 decades doing infrastructure and property work across Southeast Asia, first for an American engineering conglomerate and later on his own account, and had accumulated, in the process, the kind of relationships that don't show up on any org chart but outlast most of them. At the time it registered as nothing more than a son's quiet pride in his father. I had no reason yet to understand it as the door it would eventually become. The divorce itself moved with an efficiency that still strikes me as almost cruel in its cleanliness. We had accumulated little as a couple. Claire's family had seen to that, in their own way, by making sure nothing we owned together could root us too deeply. So the apartment sold quickly, the modest assets split evenly, the whole marriage dissolved with the tidy precision of a controlled demolition. What broke me wasn't the paperwork. It was watching Sid stand beside Claire through every step of it, his hand at the small of her back with a proprietary ease that told me he'd already claimed the territory before I'd finished vacating it. After the papers were signed, Sid caught me alone near the elevator bank, one hand in his pocket, entirely at ease, the posture of a man who has already collected everything he came for. Ethan, he said my name the way you'd handle a coat check ticket you didn't need anymore. No hard feelings, I hope. None, I said, though the word cost me something to produce evenly. Can I ask you something? He didn't wait for permission. What's it like, not being able to make a woman like that happy? I mean it genuinely. I'm curious. Was it the money, or was it just you? I looked at him a moment before answering, cataloging, almost against my will, the practiced ease of his smile, the particular satisfaction of a man who has clearly rehearsed this exact conversation in a mirror more than once. I made her happy for a while, I said. I just wasn't fast enough to keep doing it. That's a generous way to put it. It's an accurate way to put it. I held his eyes. You'll find out eventually, Sid, that speed and happiness aren't the same measurement. I hope you find that out gently. Most people don't. He laughed, short and unconvinced, said something about hoping I'd land on my feet, and walked off toward Claire without waiting for a reply. I didn't offer one. I have found, over the years, that silence is sometimes the only structurally sound response to a foundation someone else is trying to crack. Within weeks of the divorce, David and I founded Callahan and Associates Environmental Consulting. It was David, not me, who first suggested we look past Florida entirely. His father had been telling him for years that Southeast Asia was building cities faster than anywhere else on Earth and doing it carelessly, and that a firm willing to do the unglamorous, patient work properly would never run out of clients there. I took the suggestion the way I took most things that year, numbly, gratefully, without much capacity to imagine what it would actually become. Within months, Claire and Sid had moved in together, their engagement announced with the kind of speed that suggested it had been waiting in the wings all along. And within the year, I had left Miami entirely, not fleeing exactly, though it must have looked that way to anyone watching, but pursuing something closer to remediation and carrying, in my one checked bag, a short list of names David's father had given me in Jakarta. I needed distance the way a contaminated site needs time. Not forever, but long enough for whatever was toxic in me to break down into something inert. 7 years. That was how long I stayed away, and it was David's voice, crackling through the bus's spotty signal as we crossed into Redland, that pulled me back into the present. You landed, he said, no greeting, exactly like him. I landed. Maybe 20 minutes out now. House is ready. We had it cleaned last week. Gardens cut back, AC's been running so it won't feel like a swamp when you walk in. A pause, then, quieter, more like the friend I'd known for 20 years than the business partner I'd built a company with. Welcome home, Ethan. I mean that. Thank you, David. For all of it. The house, the 7 years, all of it. Don't thank me yet. I could hear him grin through the phone. Emma's been driving me out of my mind. How so? She wants to see you. Has wanted to see you since roughly year 2 of this whole arrangement, if I'm being honest. He exhaled, the sound of a man finally setting down something he'd been carrying a long time. I talked her out of flying out to you more times than I can count. Told her to give you room. Told her you needed to put yourself back together first before anyone added anything else to the load. She listened, mostly because she trusts me more than she trusts her own patience. And now I can't hold her back anymore, and honestly, I don't think I should try. He paused. Ethan, I'm going to say something, and I need you to actually hear it instead of doing the thing you do, where you file it away and never open the folder again. I'm listening. My sister loves you. She's loved you for years. I watched it happen in real time and never said a word, because you were in no state to hear it. 7 years, Ethan. She waited through 7 years of you being on the other side of the planet, and she never once looked twice at anyone else. That's not a crush. That's not a kid-sister thing. That's a decision she's been making over and over for 7 straight years. I didn't answer right away. The bus rattled past a produce stand, past a row of royal palms leaning into the wind, and I sat there with David's words doing something slow and structural to my chest. I don't know what to do with that, I finally said. You don't have to do anything with it today, David said. Just don't be an idiot about it when you see her. That's all I'm asking. I reached the house not long after, and it looked almost unchanged. The same wraparound porch, the same mango tree leaning companionably over the roofline, the same hush of a place built for a slower species of happiness. I stood on the porch for a long moment before going inside, feeling something in my chest loosen by a few careful degrees, the way pressure eases when a relief valve finally opens. Emma found me still surrounded by half-open boxes in the front room, and before I'd fully registered she was there, She'd crossed the distance between us and thrown both arms around me hard enough to nearly take us both off our feet. "You," she said into my shoulder, "are in so much trouble." "Good to see you too, Emma." She pulled back to look at me, and I found myself recalibrating everything I remembered about her. The girl I'd left behind, David's kid sister, quick with a joke, always underfoot at family dinners, had become a woman of 30 with an ease in her own presence that filled a room without any visible effort. She was laughing at something before I'd even said anything worth laughing at, the particular laugh of someone who has decided, deliberately, to be delighted by you. 7 years, Callahan. She poked me in the chest, hard enough to make her point. 7 years, and the first thing you do when you finally get back is unpack boxes without calling me first. I've been off the plane for 2 hours. 2 hours is 1 hour and 59 minutes too long. She dropped onto the arm of the sofa, watching me unwrap a stack of my mother's old books with an attention that felt entirely disproportionate to the task. "Did you think about me at all? Out there, wherever you were, saving the world one wetland at a time?" "Every day," I said, and meant it more than I let show. "Liar." She said it lightly, but her eyes held mine a beat longer than the joke required. "If you thought about me every day, you'd have called more than twice a year." "I called when I had something worth saying." "And you never had anything worth saying to me in 7 years?" She raised an eyebrow, half mock-offended, half something else entirely, something that felt, if I let myself look at it directly, dangerously close to hope. "That's either very sad or very cowardly, Ethan, and I honestly haven't decided which." I set the books down and looked at her properly for the first time since she'd walked in. Past the joke, past the easy performance of teasing. And something in my chest tightened in a way I recognized and immediately distrusted. Maybe I didn't trust myself to say it right. "Try now," she said, and there was nothing joking in her voice at all. She'd gone very still, watching me with an openness that made me acutely aware of every unguarded thing about her. The way she'd leaned forward slightly, the way her hands had stopped moving entirely. I hesitated. 7 years of careful containment don't dissolve in a single afternoon, no matter how much a man might want them to. "Emma, you're doing the thing," she said, before I could finish, some of the lightness returning to her voice, though not all of it. "The thing where you retreat into the equipment room and start checking valves instead of just saying what you're feeling. I don't have an equipment room metaphor ready for this one." "You will," she said, standing, brushing invisible dust from her jeans, restoring herself to the cheerful version of herself with what I now understood was a deliberate, practiced ease. "Take your time, Ethan. I've waited 7 years. I can wait a little longer." She kissed my cheek, quick and warm, and added, already walking toward the kitchen, "But not forever. Just so we're clear." From that day forward, Emma became a fixture in the house, and, soon after, in the business. Or at least in the version of the business that lived in Redland. What she saw and managed with real skill was the domestic side, the Tampa and Jacksonville remediation contracts, the site visits, the permit filings, the modest, steady work that had first gotten Callahan and Associates on its feet. She knew, somehow, exactly which of those projects David had routed my way, and she insisted, with an immovability I eventually stopped trying to negotiate with, on serving as the firm's office manager, running our small satellite operation out of the converted study where my mother used to keep her sewing machine. Clients began making the drive out to Redland for meetings, and I watched Emma handle them with an easy competence that made me wonder how we'd ever managed without her. What she didn't see, because I had never let it come anywhere near Redland, was the other half of the business entirely. The Southeast Asian work ran through its own channel, coordinated directly between David, Arthur Ashford's old contacts, and me, on a rhythm of long-haul flights and video calls scheduled around a dozen time zones, with its own small team based out of Singapore rather than out of my mother's sewing room. I had built it that way on purpose, at first simply because the two sides of the business genuinely required different infrastructure. And then, somewhere along the way, because keeping Redland untouched by all of it meant I had one place left in the world that still felt like mine alone. I told myself, more than once, that I would loop Emma in eventually. I kept finding reasons the moment hadn't quite arrived. I brought the situation up with David one evening on the porch, both of us nursing beers we'd stopped actually drinking about 20 minutes into the conversation. "I need to talk to you about Emma," I said. "Do you?" David said, not looking up from whatever he'd decided was more interesting on the horizon. "I don't want to make things complicated. For you, for the business, for Ethan." He finally turned to face me. "She's 30 years old. She doesn't need her brother's permission to have feelings, and neither do you. This is between the two of you. You're not going to weigh in at all. Not one word." He took a pull from the beer he'd been ignoring. "I've spent 7 years watching my sister wait for a man who wasn't even in the country. I'm not about to spend an 8th year telling that same man what to do about it now that he is. Figure it out yourselves. I'll be there for the wedding, or I'll be there to help you both get over it. Either way, leave me out of the diagnostics." There was a season, a few weeks into my return, when odd things began happening that I chose not to explain to Emma in full. A producer from a Southeast Asian broadcaster called Seat requested an interview. When Emma asked what it concerned, I told her, vaguely, that it was business, the kind of deliberate vagueness an engineer uses when a design is still in its early, unstable phase and premature disclosure could compromise the whole structure. When national networks and then international ones started calling, her curiosity sharpened into something closer to suspicion. I deflected as gently as I could, telling her that environmental work always drew press attention eventually, that CNN and NBC loved nothing more than a controversy dressed in an ecological cause. She let it go, though I could tell, watching the small furrow that appeared and disappeared at her brow, that she filed the inconsistency away rather than discarding it. The invitation, when it came, arrived on heavy cream cardstock from a client I'd worked closely with for years. An Indonesian conglomerate headquartered in Singapore, whose name Emma didn't yet fully recognize, though I did, intimately. A reception at the St. Regis Ball Harbor Resort. +1. Emma insisted on coming the moment she heard the words, +1, and I found I had neither the will nor, if I'm honest, the desire to refuse her. I wore a suit that was clean, well-fitted, and entirely without ornament. I had learned, in Southeast Asia, that understatement often carries more authority than display. Emma wore black, a gown elegant in its restraint but unable to fully disguise the vitality underneath it, the kind of dress that doesn't announce a woman so much as confirm what was already obvious. The St. Regis lobby glittered the way certain rooms are engineered to glitter. Faceted mirrors throwing light in every direction, a crystal chandelier suspended like a held breath, floor-to-ceiling glass opening onto a dark, restless ocean. The reception hall beyond it was already full of Miami's upper stratum, jazz drifting over a low tide of conversation, champagne moving through the crowd with the practiced fluency of a well-designed distribution system. I saw Claire first, then Sid, then Stefan and Margareth, gathered near the bar in a posture of easy ownership, as though the room itself had been built to their specifications. My pulse spiked. I felt it in my throat, in the sudden coolness of my hands, a physiological response I recognized clinically even as I experienced it personally, adrenaline flooding a system that hadn't fully forgiven the last time it was tested in this exact configuration. Emma noticed before I said a word. Her hand found mine and closed around it, firm and warm, an anchor dropped exactly when I needed the ballast. Stefan crossed toward us first, unhurried, his smile calibrated to precisely the right wattage for a room full of people worth impressing. Margareth trailed half a step behind him, her own smile thinner, colder, a garnish rather than an expression. Ethan. Stefan extended a hand. It's been a long time. You look, he paused, as if hunting for exactly the right word, rested. Redland agrees with me, I said, shaking his hand. I imagine it would. Very restful part of the county. His gaze slid past me, toward Emma, with a courtesy so thin it was nearly transparent. And how's the little consulting business these days? Still just you and David? Or have you managed to hire a receptionist yet? We've grown, I said. Slowly. You know how I am about slow. I remember. Margaretha's voice arrived cold and clipped. Some things don't change. Some things don't need to, I said. Stefan's smile tightened by a degree I doubt anyone else in the room would have caught. You should send me a proposal, Ethan, genuinely. My firm's always looking for an environmental consultant we can get at a reasonable rate. I imagine your rates are still accommodating. I'll have my office send something over this week, I said, keeping my voice perfectly level, perfectly pleasant, because I had learned, across 7 years and 2 continents, that the calmest man in a room usually ends up owning it. Though I think you'll find our rates have changed, along with quite a lot else. Something flickered behind Stefan's eyes. Not alarm, not yet, but the first faint tremor of a man quietly revising an old estimate. Margaretha's cold smile didn't move a fraction, but her gaze dropped, briefly, to Emma's hand wrapped around mine, and something in her expression soured further still. Charming, Margaretha said, in the tone of a woman filing a formal complaint. Truly. Beside me, I felt Emma's fingers tighten around mine, not from nerves, I realized, but from the visible effort of holding back a response considerably less polite than anything I'd said aloud. I ran my thumb once across her knuckles and felt her breathe out. Claire and Sid arrived a moment later, moving through the crowd with the easy, proprietary glide of 2 people who had never once doubted their welcome anywhere. Ethan, Sid said my name the way you'd greet a coat check mix-up. Are you sure you're at the right event? I'd hate for you to have wandered and looking for something else entirely. I was invited, I said. By name, if you're curious. Must be a mistake on the guest list then, Sid said, smiling in a way engineered to look friendly to everyone except me. Or maybe the guest list finally caught up to something you haven't yet, I said, and watched the smile falter, just slightly, before he covered it. Claire turned to Emma with a warmth so manufactured I could practically hear the machinery behind it. Emma, it's been so long. How have you been? Wonderful, actually, Emma said, matching her tone precisely, sweetness with an edge honed carefully underneath it. Life's been very good to me lately. I can see that. Claire's eyes moved, deliberately, from Emma's face down to our joined hands, and something calculating settled over her expression. You look radiant. I don't think I've ever seen you look quite this. She paused, choosing the word with visible care. Settled. I am settled, Emma said. Very. Funny, Claire said, her voice sharpening into something with real teeth underneath the silk. Because I don't recall receiving an invitation to your wedding, Ethan. When exactly did that happen? Or is this a small, deliberately cruel glance down at our hands? Still just a work arrangement. I felt Emma go very still beside me for exactly 1 heartbeat. Then she smiled, a wide, warm, entirely unbothered smile, and stepped in close enough that her shoulder pressed against my arm. We only just got engaged, Emma said. Very recently. We wanted to keep it quiet a little longer, but since you're asking, she extended her left hand, bare of any ring, with total, unhesitating confidence. Of course you'll be invited to the wedding, Claire. We wouldn't dream of leaving you out. Claire's face lost color so quickly it would have been almost comic in any other context. Congratulations, she managed, the word arriving several seconds too late to sound remotely sincere. Thank you, Emma said sweetly. That means a lot, coming from you. I felt my own surprise flare somewhere behind my ribs and kept it, with real effort, entirely off my face. I only smiled, the specific smile of a man agreeing to a story because the story was doing exactly the work it needed to do, and let my arms settle, naturally, around Emma's waist. "We're very happy," I added, which had the strange advantage of being, in its own way, completely true. The room changed before anyone announced why. The jazz thinned to nothing. Conversations dropped into an expectant hush, and every head turned toward the entrance where John Amsahanto had just arrived. Amsahanto Coalition Holding was, by any measure, one of the most significant conglomerates in Southeast Asia, and John himself, 60 years old, dressed with the understated precision of a man who had long since stopped needing to prove anything through his clothing, carried a presence that reorganized a room simply by entering it. His wife, Lena Chun, walked beside him in a gown so quietly elegant it took a moment to register its cost. They moved through the crowd, greeting people with the efficient warmth of hosts who knew exactly whose hands were worth shaking. And then John's eyes found mine across the room, and everything about his posture changed. His face opened into genuine, unguarded delight. He crossed the room straight toward us, both hands extending before he'd even fully arrived, and pulled me into a handshake that turned, halfway through, into something closer to an embrace, sweeping past Stefan and Margaretha's half-raised hands of greeting as though they simply didn't register on the same frequency. "Ethan," his voice carried, warm and unguarded, cutting easily through the low hum of the room. "You came. Good. I would have been very disappointed in you otherwise. You know how I feel about people who skip my parties. Wouldn't have missed it," I said. "This is Emma." John turned to her with the same unguarded warmth, taking her hand in both of his. "Emma, any friend of Ethan's is already a friend of mine and Lena's. I mean that as a fact, not a courtesy." Beside him, Lena offered Emma a smile of genuine, easy warmth. "I hope Ethan has told you what a headache he was, in the early years, refusing every fee increase we tried to give him." "He hasn't mentioned that," Emma said, glancing at me with open curiosity. "He'll have plenty to explain later, I suspect." John's eyes carried a glint of mischief. "Tonight, though, I have something to announce, and I need him standing beside me when I do it." I watched Stefan, Margaretha, Claire, and Sid take in this exchange with expressions caught somewhere between confusion and alarm, for people trying to recalibrate an instrument that had just returned a reading none of them could reconcile with what they thought they knew. John climbed the small stage arranged at the front of the hall a few minutes later, and the room settled into the particular hush that gathers before something important is about to be said. He tapped the microphone once, unnecessarily, out of old habit, and began. "Thank you all for coming tonight," he said, his voice carrying easily to every corner of the hall. "I promise not to keep you from the champagne for long. I'm here tonight to announce that Amsahanto Coalition Holding is beginning a new chapter. A township development, built in partnership with investors across Southeast Asia and here in Florida, and folded into a federal initiative for sustainable urban growth that I believe will change how this country builds its cities for the next 50 years. But before I say anything more about the project itself, I want to introduce you to the man who made it possible. For years, this man has been the technical backbone of every major development my company has built across Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand, and the Philippines. He is the architect of a model: energy conservation done properly, environmental stewardship at a premium standard, urban waste converted into biofuel, circular economy principles built into the bones of a project rather than bolted on afterward, carbon trading, renewable power generation. A model Southeast Asia now treats as the standard, not the exception. Ladies and gentlemen, Ethan Callahan is now cited by environmental authorities, urban planners, and property developers on nearly every continent, and I am fortunate enough to call him both my consultant and my friend. Ethan, please join me. I felt my chest tighten, the old reflex of a man who has spent years avoiding exactly this kind of exposure. Emma, sensing it immediately, turned to look at me. Not with confusion, but with something that looked remarkably like pride arriving ahead of understanding, and her fingers tightened around mine as if to say, "Whatever this is, I am not letting go of your hand while it happens." I climbed the 3 shallow steps to the stage with a composure I did not, internally, entirely feel. A year ago, John continued, once I was standing beside him, ASEAN honored Ethan with its regional award for environmental leadership in recognition of the community and environment-conscious development model he built across our region. Tonight, I want to make it official and public. Callahan and Associates Environmental Consulting will be fully integrated into this project, and Ethan will sit on its governing board. He turned to face me directly, his hand briefly on my shoulder. Welcome to the next chapter, my friend. Florida is lucky to have you back. I found Stefan, Margareth, Claire, and Sid in the crowd. Their faces had drained of color, their mouths slightly open, their eyes carrying the particular cocktail of panic, humiliation, and a thin current of fear, the exact expression of people watching a structure they dismissed as unsound suddenly reveal itself to be load-bearing for the entire building. Stefan's expression carried something the others didn't. I had watched him, for years, angle for exactly this kind of access. John Amsahanto was precisely the sort of man Stefan spent entire dinner parties maneuvering to be introduced to, the sort of name he dropped in a conversation the way other men mentioned the weather. And here was John, radiating a warmth and a respect toward me that Stefan had never once managed to earn for himself, not in 3 decades of trying. I watched something in Stefan's shoulders give way, an almost imperceptible slackening, the specific posture of a man watching his own scale of values collapse in real time. His jaw worked once, as though he meant to say something and found nothing available to say. He didn't meet my eyes again for the rest of the evening. For a man who had spent a lifetime measuring other men's worth by how quickly they moved and how high they climbed, there could have been no quieter defeat than standing perfectly still while the room rearranged itself around someone he'd once dismissed as going nowhere. The journalists John had specifically invited were already writing, already reaching for the version of this story that would run in tomorrow's national coverage. The township, the ASEAN Award, the quiet Redland engineer who'd turned out to be neither quiet nor small. None of them had come for gossip, and none of them, as far as I could tell, had caught the exchange with Claire at all. Whatever Emma had invented in that one unguarded minute stayed exactly where she'd meant it to stay, inside the Whitmore family's own private humiliation, never once making it into print. On the drive back to Redland, Emma and I talked, finally, about the engagement she'd invented on the spot to shield me from one more small humiliation. "You didn't have to do that," I said. "I know," she said. "I wanted to. I couldn't stand there and watch them treat you like you were beneath consideration one more time, not after everything." She glanced over at me, some of her nerve finally slipping. "Are you upset?" "No," I said, and found I meant it completely. "I'm not upset." "Good." A small, satisfied smile. "Because if you were, I'd have to bury you alive somewhere in Redland, and I like the house too much to make that mess." She meant it as a joke, the kind that lets 2 people breathe out after a very long night. But I found I didn't want the moment to close on a joke. Not this one. "Emma." Something in my voice stopped her mid-laugh. She turned to look at me properly, and whatever she saw on my face made her go quiet in the particular way she reserved for things she took seriously. "I don't want it to be a lie," I said. "The engagement. I don't want it to be something you had to invent just to get me out of a room gracefully." She didn't answer right away. Her hands, I noticed, had gone still in her lap. The same stillness I'd cataloged in her once before, in the front room, surrounded by boxes, the day I hadn't been ready to answer her. I love you, Emma. I think I've loved you since before I let myself call it that, and I've spent longer than I care to admit running load calculations on a feeling that never needed the analysis in the first place. I kept my eyes on the road, the same as I hadn't trusted my face 9 years ago in a very different car, though nothing about this silence felt anything like that one. Marry me. Not because Claire asked an ugly question at a party. Because I want to build the rest of this with you, on purpose, out loud. For a long moment, she said nothing at all, and the quiet in the car took on a different texture than the one we'd been sitting in a minute before. Not tense, but full, the specific fullness of a system finally reaching the equilibrium it had been straining toward for years. "What took you so long?" she finally asked, and her voice wasn't teasing anymore, though it wasn't quite steady either. 7 years gone, 3 months back, and you're doing this at 11 o'clock at night in a car that smells like a rental. I didn't trust myself to get it right the first 100 times I almost said it. And now I'd rather get it wrong out loud than get it right and never say it at all. She was quiet again, just long enough that my chest tightened with something close to the old fear. Then she reached over and took my hand off the wheel, threading her fingers through mine with a certainty that answered the question before her mouth did. "Yes," she said. "Obviously yes. I've been saying yes to you since I was 23, Ethan. You're the only one who's taken this long to catch up." I laughed. Really laughed, for what felt like the first time since the plane had touched down, and for the rest of the drive back to Redland, neither of us said very much else. We didn't need to. Some silences, I've found, carry exactly the load they're built to carry. Within the week, my face was on national television, on SEA TV, on programs I'd spent years quietly avoiding. Everyone I'd once known in Miami understood, more or less simultaneously, that I had returned not diminished but transformed. The truth surfaced soon enough, that David and I, working the Southeast Asian channel opened years earlier by his father, Arthur Ashford, had spent 7 years building something patient and enormous out of what had once looked, to everyone watching from Coral Gables, like a man's quiet retreat from failure. Claire wrote to me a few days later. She told me she understood now, with real clarity, that I possessed a quality most people never develop. She apologized, specifically and at length, for everything. I never answered her message, though I had forgiven her long before it arrived. Forgiveness, I've found, doesn't always require a reply to be complete, the way a treated effluent doesn't need the river's permission to finally run clear. I didn't have the fortune the Whitmores had built their lives around, and I never would. But I had something that had taken 7 years of quiet, deliberate retention to become stable. A life built at the right scale, Emma steady beside me, David solid at my back, and a peace that no longer needed anyone else's approval to hold its shape. As for the lie Emma told at the St. Regis, the engagement, the bare left hand she'd held up with such total, unhesitating confidence, it didn't stay a lie for very long. By the time we reached Redland that same night, I'd already turned it into something true, and neither of us has felt any need to explain the difference to anyone since. Not to David, not to Claire, not even to each other in the quiet of an ordinary evening. Some structures, I've learned, don't need to be declared finished to already be carrying real load. Ours, I suspect, had been carrying it for years before either of us finally said so out loud.